Hi, everybody. Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It's April 23rd, 2024. It's a Tuesday, and we are in the Student Learning Center. There's people in the room, people online, people in the future, which will be there present on YouTube. And so today, we're continuing with our reading of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and we are doing Habit 1. We finally got to Habit 1, which is be proactive. And we look at the system that Stephen Covey has developed, going from dependence to independence to interdependence. And he breaks up each transition of growth into specific habits. So being dependent to independent, those are the habits of private victory. And being independent to interdependent, those are public victory habits. So there's personal habits we work on, and then habits we work in a group context. So some things that have come up, I was thinking about using the board a little bit today, but is the notion of character. I was thinking about that, and I didn't really talk about it last time, so I'll mention it briefly right now. And he says that, like, you know, the composite of character is your habits, or your habits make up your character. And so what is character really, you know? And when we think of like a story or a narrative, a character is an identifying, like, how you would identify one person from the other. This is the kind of role they play within the story, right? So when we talk about character as an individual in our lives, it's like how you would distinguish yourself going over time across situations, making decisions in certain kinds of situations, right? Or having an ambiguous situation. And you say, this person is of this character. That means we can kind of determine how they would act or behave within that context. And so character is made up of an individual's values and also their habits, how they act, right, over time. And it's also part of it is their personality as well. So personality is a smaller category than character. Your personality makes up part of your character, but the thing that's missing from personality would be values and habits specifically, because a personality is a general way of acting or behaving across situations. Whereas habits would be the mode of action, how you're specifically acting with this one behavioral tendency, right? So, okay, so I think it's important to clear that up. And then again, we've discussed the notion of principles. So we have a certain value in mind, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. It has importance in and of itself, or which is intrinsic, or it has importance for some other reason. Which is instrumental or extrinsic. There's a consequence to this value. And so principles are going to be the kinds of things that we do for a specific kind of outcome. And in this case, it would be being effective. So like, let's say you were nursing, just as a thing, there will be principles of nursing, meaning that these are the best practices of this field, right? And so principles apply to all fields in some ways. And it's how we simplify the nature of the field so that when we go and do stuff, we're more effective in doing that stuff. And so for this book, the principles specifically on our how to, like, this is why we're teaching this or discussing it, is how to live well, right? How to be effective and successful. And the nature is basically on the human condition. And it is relatively psychological because we're talking about habits, right? And so learning this stuff is valuable in that sense. And I think it's wise, i.e. philosophical, to learn this in a practical sense. And then, like, as a group of the Philosophy Society, we can instill these habits together. We can learn to support each other and reinforce each other when we're doing specific things so that we're more effective as a group, right? So that's why we're doing this. Okay. So habit 1, be proactive. So we have that diagram and I have slides. So we're going to start on page 74. Okay, so we have the 7 habits of highly effective people. So this is habit 1. So as I said before, what the process of me doing this is I'm going to read through the slides, and then we're going to meticulously go through the book, and there'll be certain points where we're going to philosophize. What is the meaning of this? Or how does it fit together, right? And if you guys want to interject at any time, that's the benefit of being here. You can be like, hey, I want to say something. And if you're online, you can say something too. Just be mindful of the video stuff. You're going to be on YouTube if you make your video there. So I'm just going to read through these. So these are the principles. And part of the criticism of the book is the way that it's structured. It's not it could be more clear what the principles really are. Oh yeah, and going back to the previous thing, so we have our values, which our principles would be an enactment of those values that are very general, and the habits are behavioral specifics on how to act out the principles. So in the book, it's not as clear what the principles really are, but they are throughout each chapter, right? And they are a justification for specific kinds of habits or certain values. So, okay, first one is we are not our feelings, we are not our moods, we are not even our thoughts. Now, this goes back to what we discussed with the David Burns stuff, that we are not our cognitions, right? So the first book we went through with the group was called Feeling Good. And feeling good, we look at, it's a response to the way we look and see the world and what we tell ourselves, so we're not depressed or angry or procrastinate. It helps us with our mental health. And so this first principle is in line with that as well, right? Second is between stimulus and response is our greatest power, the freedom to choose. So this is fundamentally what this chapter is based on, right? And it's an underlying axiom. About a month ago, I talked about axioms of belief. And if this wasn't true, basically the entire chapter and book would be also false. It would be a straw man fallacy. But I think that there is some truth to this, and there is some philosophizing we're going to do, that sometimes we do have limitations and we do lack self-control. Therefore, we will indirectly influence by changing our environment or by not spending time with a certain person because they make us feel uncomfortable, whatever that might be, right? We can have boundaries in relationships. The next is, no one can hurt you without your consent, Roosevelt. Again, this goes back to the David Burns thing. David Burns gives us this example of if you're in a psychiatric ward and a schizophrenic patient says, I'm God, I'm God. And then the next thing the patient says is, you're the devil. How much would you let that individual's opinion affect you? And you would say, well, not very much, right? Because this individual is not of sound mind. And so whenever somebody, and this is part of the thesis, whenever somebody says something to you that is attacking or hurting your self-esteem, he adamantly says this in this chapter, is that you are the one that decides whether or not you're going to allow them to hurt you, right? And so there is some power in that, but I think it's important to recognize that we do have limitations, right? We might be stressed out, and I think there's a balance there, of determining what can we actually put boundaries towards, and then what will affect us whether we like it or not in some ways. And so, but he kind of just says that's not the case. He says no matter what your DNA is, your genetics, the way you were parented, or your current circumstances, you always have a choice. So he's very, very, absolute about that, which is good in some ways. Maybe it's a good thing. Let's at least try that first. And he references this, not to engage in the self-fulfilling prophecy, where I have a belief that's false, and then I act based on that false belief, and it makes it true because of my action, right? And so it's better to have a false belief that's empowering than disempowering. And then we act. It's like the statement or the principle or the belief that fake it till you make it. Like that's okay. Sure, we can talk about that, but I think it's better to talk about the self-fulfilling prophecy and then behavior, because the fake it till you make it approach, sometimes people can just only fake it and never actually make anything happen. And it goes into the wishful thinking thing, is that we have delusional beliefs, but there's nothing happening in the world. There's no action, right? Mm-hmm. So, okay. Next, they cannot take away our self-respect if we do not give it to them. This is a Gandhi thing. So he discusses how Gandhi made decisions, was proactive, right? He made a choice. And being proactive fundamentally for Covey is about choice. And he chose to not let the British colonizers rule over India, and he didn't deal with it through violence, right? It's not what happens to us, but our response to what happens that hurts us. So again, that goes back to the previous quote before. And the reason for this one, and he discusses that in this chapter, is because there's a distinction between what we care about and what's in our control. And what's in our control fundamentally is the most important thing when it comes to where our emotions are displayed, how we utilize our emotions and for what purpose. And what really matters in regards to our agency. Like, what are we doing is different than what is happening to me, right? Our most difficult experiences become the crucibles that forge our character and develop the internal powers, the freedom to handle difficult circumstances in the future and to aspire others to do so as well. So in those ambiguous moments, that's when a principle is super useful. When you don't have a habit or a way to act, you're like, what do I do here? And that's where this is again where I think that philosophy is supposed to have something to say as the subject that discusses wisdom, right? And wisdom in some ways is like, how are we not make mistakes in our experiences? What are we doing now? And how is that going to impact us over time in general, right? When he says that these difficult experiences, that's when your character, and again, the values you have and the kinds of decisions you make, not based on the descriptive, this is who I am now, but the ideal that I'm achieving, the kind of person I want to become. And part of that can just recognizing your limitations. If some relationship is unhealthy, if you continue to go down that road, it may lead to a worse place, right? Whether it's an intimate relationship, friendship, or somewhere in the workplace, you know what I mean? And you have the freedom to choose to not be there, right? Yeah, so internal powers. So he talks about these endowments in this chapter. We'll go through those. And he uses the word endowment because he's fundamentally, and again, I'm an atheist, but he's speaking from a position of a Christian, which is fine. And his justification is these come from God. Whereas as someone who doesn't believe in that, I would say that they're just a natural product of evolution for a sophisticated being as we are, right? It helped us survive, to have agency, self-awareness, and free will, or the ability to make decisions and actions in the moment based on our own agency. And then there's projection into the future, and then working with others in a constructive way, which he talks about being inspiring to them. And so this is slide 2 of the principles. So I'll just finish this principles section and then we'll go to the book. So if you wait so this is a review of these are specific quotes from the text. So I just put them all at the beginning. That way we know what the principles are. I think it's a better organizational method. So if you wait to be acted upon, you will be acted upon. So that's the opposite of being proactive. That's being reactive, right? Or being passive, which is different than being assertive. Attitudes and behaviors flow out of our paradigms, the way we see the world. If we use our self-awareness to examine them, we can often see them in the nature of our underlying maps, which is, again, a paradigm. And so our perspective on the world is the first thing that matters, because from that perspective, that's where we'll have certain behaviors or emotional dispositions towards things, how I feel about it, or my attitude, right? Utilizing our self-awareness, that's one of the endowments he talks about, to examine what our paradigms are, what our attitudes and what our behaviors are. And we can see them in the nature of our underlying maps. So this statement is a little bit circular because he actually equates paradigms with maps earlier. So it's hard to, philosophically, that's a bit of a problem. We could change that out with, in our underlying nature, and you could just stop the sentence there, and then you wouldn't have that problem. By working on ourselves instead of worrying about one's condition, or you can use the word character, we are able to influence our conditions. And so there's ourselves in the situation, and then there's other people and the environment, right? And then ourselves is fundamentally how we see things, right? So he will say very often in this chapter, if you think the problem is out there, that way of thinking about the problem is the problem, which is the paradigm thing, how we see things, right? And again, I think we can discuss that a little bit. How accurate is it to look at things that way? That sometimes the problem is out there, right? Like if there's a fire, is the problem me, or is the problem that there's a fire in the room, right? Well, the fire is the main thing. My attitude, behavior, or perception of the fire isn't really the thing. So I think that there are some problems in the way that he's conceptualizing that. So this is the Serenity prayer, and it's used in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it has some merit in our well-being and a eudaimonic lifestyle, right? So grant us the courage to change things we cannot change, the serenity to accept the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that is at the heart of the difference between the sphere of control and the sphere of concern, right? There are things that we're in control of, and there are things that we worry about, and knowing where those things lie is wisdom, essentially, you would say, right? Anytime we think the problem is out there, that is the problem. So again, is that true, this statement? You know, basically, that statement means that there are no such things as problems, and you would always be the problem all the time, right? And Burns would say, hey, that sounds like a distortion. Number 10, the personalization distortion, which would be accepting responsibility for things that are not in your control. And that's going to make you upset, right? So if someone's in like an abusive relationship, for example, how would be changing your attitude or your paradigm about the other person's behavior be constructive when it's them that really is the one who's in control of that, right? And I think that's important. It's that we each have our own agency. We may influence each other's, but we're fundamentally responsible for the way that we act. And some relationships may just be unhealthy, right? And so we have to figure that out. And the last principle here, we are free to choose our actions. We are not free to choose the consequences of those actions. So this has to do with probability and assessing what the likelihood of something occurring is. And we may do something with an expectation that it might have some result, but things happen in the cosmos, and it's not 100% for sure. Science is the capacity to predict outcomes, right? And you would say, oh, well, I'm going to do some procedure to this patient. This is the outcome, and then something else happens. So we just didn't expect there was some bacteria in the room. We don't know what happened, right? We're going to figure it out so that we can narrow down the unexpectedness of our predictions. Okay, so let's go to the book here. This is going to be a little bit of a long chapter. There's a lot of slides here, but it's a lot of content. We're going to get through it today. It's going to be good. Okay, so on page 74, so I'm not sure which page number that is for you, but you guys, it's the same page. So he gives this quote by Thoreau at the beginning. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of humans to evaluate their life by a conscious endeavor. So that's going back to this notion of agency that which is in contrast to determinism, that we are fundamentally an agent. We have the capacity for rational choice, right? So the very beginning, he is going to say, he wants you to do this cognitive exercise, right? He says he wants us to stand apart from ourselves, project our consciousness upward to a corner of the room and see yourself in your mind's eye reading. So if you're sitting here, you imagine yourself up there looking down on yourself, right? A bird's eye view. Can you look at yourself almost as though you were someone else? Think about the mood you were having. Can you identify it? What are you feeling? How would you describe your present mental state? Think about how your mind is working. Is it quick? Is it alert? Do you sense you are torn between doing this specific exercise or evaluating the point to be made out of it? So what he's saying is this capacity, our ability to do what he's asking us, is uniquely human. At least at this level, it's uniquely human. Animals do not possess this ability. Well, there's a little bit of evidence that some animals have a bit of self-awareness. They have the red dot experiment where they put a piece of, they put a red dot on a monkey's head and the monkey looks in the mirror and it can like touch itself. It's like, hey, there's something there. So there's like very minimum self-awareness within some animals. But the capacity that he's talking about for humans, we don't know of any other animal that has this capacity for self-awareness. The ability to think, so he defines self-awareness as the ability to think about our very thought process. Sorry?
Is it only for monkeys, or is there other animals that have
Elephants and dolphins, I think, show a little bit. Yeah, we could look that research up later. But yeah, there's a few animals that, well, not monkeys, but chimpanzees. There's a few animals that demonstrate the minimum requirement of what we would consider self-awareness.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I mirror quite a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there might be some evidence there too.
But they don't know if it's themselves.
Oh,
They think that
maybe.
So yeah, we have to distinguish, does the cat know if it is the cat or if it's just a cat, right? I think the sense of smell confuses them. They visually see it, but they can't smell the animal, right? So yeah, so it's important to these other animals demonstrating this psychological property is good for us. It kind of goes against a creationist Christian outlook, because this is used as a justification to distinguish humans from all other animals. And then the justification from there would be that gives us the right to do whatever we want with these animals, which may not be true because they're sentient beings and they suffer. So we can talk about that. But it's good because it shows how beings can evolve to have this capacity of self-awareness, which is super awesome, right? It's an alternative approach to a strictly theological Christian approach, but it's scientific and it's based in a coherent framework, right? Okay, let's continue. So again, self-awareness defined as the ability to think about our very thought process. So to that degree, metacognition, we don't know of any other animals that have that capacity. A little bit of awareness that they exist, some existential awareness, as in these cases with the other, the pets and stuff like that, or the high cognitive primates and mammals, but not to this degree. So he says, and again, this is where you see this Christian undertone. The reason why humans have dominion over all other things in the world. The reason he's saying that is because it says it in the Bible. And so I would say that's not the best way to look at it, because that's actually leading us to things like climate change, right? If God created the world, God would never create the world that would destroy itself because we're using it. Why would God do that? God's all good. You're supposed to be able to use the world however you want, right? Because it was created for us. Well, we'll see how far that goes, right? Like currently, because of the temperature of the oceans, coral reefs are being bleached white, right? And I don't know. We'll have to see what happens here. So, and why humans can make significant advances from generation to generation. So again, you can have a theological explanation for these things, or we can just say humans have survived and evolved because our capacity for self-awareness and rational thought have made us really successful, right? And that's produced or perpetuated our evolution forward. Okay, like our large brains from the generation to generation context. So we're philosophizing about the text, right? Our large brains is what makes it so that we can learn. We're given so much instinct, and our heads are super big when women give birth, right? It's as big as it can be without killing the woman. And then we have many years, like 25 years of learning about our culture and our social groups that come after the fact. We're not born with those things. So that I'm referencing evolution here as a justification for why these things are the case. So, and then he says, our self-awareness, is still on page 74, is why we can evaluate and learn from others' experiences as well as our own. So that's true. That's good. And why we can make and break our habits. So this goes back to that fundamental element of there's a gap between stimulus and response. And he appeals to Pavlovian conditioning to justify this. So he says, we are not our feelings, we are not our moods. This is in line with what Burns says. We are not even our thoughts. The fact that we can even think about these things separates us from them and from the animal world. So again, one other thing is that we are animals, actually. So this statement, we could say it's false because we are animals. Whereas the Christian perspective is they kind of distinguish themselves from animals. They're something else, right? Like some godly being with a soul, and there's a heaven, and there's this whole metaphysical justification here. We're not really going to take that stance. We're going to look at this from an empirical, sound-minded, justified perspective, right? And so self-awareness enables us to stand apart and examine even the way we see ourselves, our self-paradigm, the most fundamental paradigm of effectiveness. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's talk about that. It affects not only our attitudes and behaviors, but how we see other people. It becomes our map of the basic nature of mankind. So that self-paradigm. And self-paradigm could just be how we see humans in general, all of these different selves, or how we're evaluating our specific self. What is this being that I have called Achilles? What is it, you know? And that's where we get our self-esteem being derived from that. And when people will tell themselves certain things, like some people will have social anxiety. They'll flip on Eventbrite. I know I should go to a new event. Like I want to socialize and make friends, you know? And then they see one that they like, oh, the Philosophy Society, that may be super cool. Or I hate philosophy, whatever it is. And they're like, okay, but then they get anxiety. I can't do it. And they'll have this negative self-talk, and that will demotivate them from engaging in whether it's the bowling club, playing darts, getting super drunk, whatever it is, right? Going for walks downtown, you know? And so that self paradigm it's important to have a sense of what it is. And the only way to do that sense is through self-awareness. Now, some people psychologically may lack, we talked about this term, cognitive capacity, the capacity to be aware of themselves. So for example, if your hippocampus is damaged and you don't really have short-term memory, and you can't translate your short-term memory into long-term memory, your sense of self is going to be depreciated. Your episodic memory, the things that happen, right? You basically have like amnesia, like antegrade amnesia. You can't make new memories, right? That's going to be really tough for self-awareness. As we're plotting the graph of the self, it kind of just stops. Time keeps on going on, but we have no new data, right? And so, that's going to be tough. So some people may lack the capacity, or if you get some other kind of brain damage, prefrontal cortex or something like of the nature, right? You may not be able to be aware of yourself in the same way that a normalized brain would. And so we're going to be aware of that. Okay. So on 75, until we take in how we see ourselves and how we see others into account, we will be unable to understand how others see and feel about themselves and their world. So this is discussing the notion of empathy. Right? Being empathetic for yourself, having a sense of compassion for who you are and what you're dealing with, and then responding to that, right? And then having that same awareness of other people. We will project our intentions on their behavior and call ourselves objective. So he's making a criticism here of how we can see other people. This significantly limits our personal potential and our ability to relate to others as well. Because of the unique human capacity for self-awareness, we can examine our paradigms to determine whether they are reality or principle-based, or if they're a function of conditioning and conditions. So this is super, super important. And you can see why he wrote the chapter Inside Out, that we can be aware of our paradigms and the notion of shifting from one way of seeing the world to another way of seeing the world, right? So next section, the social mirror. Okay, yeah, so here we go. Sorry, that's the slides here. So man's ability to, so this is the first slide of principles of personal vision. Man's ability to elevate his life through conscious endeavor. This is a quote by Thoreau. And he talks about this exercise of standing apart from the self, projecting our consciousness upwards to see ourselves in the mind's eye, being mindful of our mood or mental state. The mindfulness is essentially what we're talking about here. And we're going to do a book on mindfulness later. Awareness of how the mind is working, our thought processes, awareness of our learning our habits, breaking habits, others and ourselves. Self-awareness allows us to examine how we see ourselves. Next slide. The self-paradigm affects our attitudes, behavior, and how we see others. A map of the nature of mankind. We must take into account how we see ourselves. If we don't do that, we won't be able to understand how others see themselves or their world. This will inherently limit our potential and ability to relate to others. It's important to examine our paradigms to determine if they're a reality or a principle-based approach or a function of our conditions and conditioning. Okay, so the social mirror. Sorry, I screwed up my own method of how to do this. So the social mirror is, it's because I have the pre-slide and then I go into the thing. So I just, yeah, whatever. I'll be better next time. Our current social paradigm from the opinions, perceptions, and paradigms of others. So it's a projection. So how other people think about things, we can define ourselves that way. Then there's genetic determinism. So he goes through these three properties of determinism. Our DNA, or what we've inherited, determines who we are in the moment. There's our psychological determinism, how our parents have brought us up, and which is, you could talk about emotional scripting from childhood. And then there's environmental determinism, how our situation or our condition determines what we are. He discusses the stimulus response condition, allows us to respond to a stimulus with a particular response, and he references Pavlov. Okay, so let's go to the text, 75. If the only vision we have of ourselves comes from the social mirror, from the current social paradigm, or from the opinions of others, their perceptions and their paradigms, our view of ourselves is like a reflection in a crazy mirror room at a carnival. The vision is disjointed and out of proportion. It's a projection rather than a reflection, a projection of the concerns and the character weaknesses of people giving input rather than actually reflecting what we are. The reflection of the current social paradigm tells us we're determined by conditioning and conditions. It acknowledges the tremendous power of conditioning in our lives to say that we are determined by it. We have no control over that or influence it. It creates a different map. So he says there's 3 different social maps at the bottom of 75. 3 theories of determinism that are widely accepted. Again, this book was published in 1989. Check it out. Yeah, 1989. And so the first is, they're widely accepted independently or in combination to explain the human nature. So there's genetic determinism. Your grandparents did it to you. That's why you have a temper. Your grandparents had short tempers, and that's in their DNA. It just goes through generations and you inherit it. For example, if you're Irish, it's the nature of the Irish people. He says there's psychic or psychological determinism. Your parents did it to you. Your upbringing and your childhood experiences essentially laid out, page 76 at the top, your personal tendencies and your character structure. It's why you're afraid to be in front of a group. Your parents brought you up that way. You feel terribly, for example, guilty if you make a mistake because you remember or you have some upbringing of a deep emotional scripting when you were very young and you were very vulnerable and tender and dependent at that time in your life. You quote unquote remember the emotional punishment and rejection.
Do you agree with those?
So he's to some degree we can have trauma from when we're younger, but and there is evidence that before we are in a linguistic state, we can have traumatic experiences as children that really give us a predisposition towards things. But that's not to say that you can't overcome it. It's just going to be more difficult for one person than another person. He's not agreeing with these things. He's saying that these are incorrect, but they are the general way that people will appeal to a deterministic framework, right? Genetics, how you were brought up, and then the last one here on 76, environmental determinism. Your boss is doing it to you, your spouse, some bratty teenager, the economic situation, or the policy of the country. Someone or something in your environment is responsible for your situation. Dimitri, can you mute it?
Yeah, I was about to mention
Sure.
something. I wanted to say something about that. So I believe all of these 3 determinations are really valid, and they do constitute like a large part of our character and our personality if unchecked. Like if you're kind of just mindlessly going through life, you'll accept those things, and without the conscious effort, you can't change those.
Yeah, and he's saying, so yes, he would agree with you. If you allow them to determine who and what you are, then it will.
Yeah.
But is it good for you? And do you want it to do that?
No, by all means, no.
Yeah. So that's,
And the other,
Mhm.
sorry to cut you off. The
Okay.
other cool thing as well is children can experience trauma while even still in the womb. So if the mother goes through something, the child will also experience the same trauma that the mom is going through.
That's true. So
Yeah.
on the website, I have a chapter called Inverting Trauma. And basically what I argue for is all of the negative things that happen to us, we can take that as a position of strength. And you kind of have to define yourself by it for this to work, but it's basically why I'm here, you know? Like I had traumatic stuff when I was a kid, not in a PTSD sense, but in the way that I was brought up. And then I said, I am going to not allow this to determine me, but I will define myself by it. And then I will learn psychology and philosophy and then teach people to be the best that they can be, because I've experienced it in like for a long time in my life. And so it's like someone that threw it.
Some parents do it on purpose to their kids because they think it's good.
And what do you mean?
They think it's good to cause them trauma.
Yeah, and so that might be a misguided view. Like, for example, punitive punishment, like spanking or beating a kid or
Yeah,
whatever.
they think it's good. Some of
Yeah.
them.
It's not. It's not. All the evidence suggests that
It's old thinking. Long time ago, they used to think it's good.
Yeah, there's some referencing in the Bible, I think, that says that kind of justifies that. We could criticize and say that's not the best. When we look at best practices for parenting, yeah.
It's positive reinforcement. It's good.
Positive,
They don't do it.
yeah, positive reinforcement as in like,
That's a modern way to raise children.
mhm. And authoritative parenting where we discuss it and they learn the reasoning themselves, right? And part of the problem would be that parents get burnt out. They're just tired and exhausted, and they don't have the time, you know? And so learning to manage our lives, which is what he talks about as well, so that we're not burnt out, will reduce the probability of them getting pissed off and upset and stuff like that. Right? Okay, and then another justification would be that that's why, like, there's the principle that humans, it takes a tribe to raise a child. And so being in a small group is actually more difficult if you don't have an extended family, right? So it's better for us to have something like the wisdom of social groups, the philosophy society applied to that would be that, well, we need to have like a housing context where maybe more than one family lives together and they're comfortable with each other, right? That way, if one person is having a bad day at work, they can just take the night off. And then there's like 7 other parents like, don't worry about it. We'll take care of the kids, you know? Okay, we will continue. So he says, each of these maps is based on the stimulus response theory. Think of the connection with Pavlov's experiments with the dogs, that when he rang the bell, they would salivate after they were conditioned to the bell and food. The basic idea is that we are conditioned to respond in a particular way to a particular stimulus. So we look here, you guys see that? It was made a little small, but so he has this little figure of stimulus response. It's just one after the other, right? And he says, how accurately and functionally do these deterministic maps describe the territory? How clearly do these mirrors reflect the nature of humans? Do they become self-fulfilling prophecies in a negative way, right? Are they based on principles we can validate within ourselves? So next slide. So I'm going to read the slide first. There's 3 slides here. So between stimulus response, so this goes from page 76 until 78. So he gives an example of Viktor Frankl, and Burns actually talks about Viktor Frankl's book in the foreword. So you can do this book too to catch up, which is good. And the reason I teach Feeling Good is because from a wisdom perspective or living a good life, reducing mental illness or not suffering because of our emotions seems like one of the most wise things to do. A lot of our suffering comes from misplaced emotions, and Feeling Good will teach us and give us the skills to manage our emotions effectively. So we just go through that book, right? I don't have videos on it, but I have some modules where I wrote stuff out that you can read with the text. Okay, so Viktor Frankl. So in the beginning of Feeling Good, he compares people reading Feeling Good to reading Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, right? And Viktor Frankl has this sense of self-awareness and this proactive way to define himself and not let others hurt him in some way. Like he's not going to let others impose their will on him, even though he was being tortured and stuff like that in the concentration camps and whatever. And so his book is meaningful in some ways because it goes through this struggle, right? But even though it goes through this struggle, it doesn't teach people the skills of cognitive behavioral therapy, which Burns, his book, does, right? And so when you compare the 2 groups, the ones that read Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's book, they didn't improve in the same capacity that those that read Feeling Good did. Okay, so side note, doesn't mean that Viktor Frankl's book isn't valuable. It's just that it's not going to teach you how to not be depressed in the same way that Feeling Good will. Because Feeling Good looks at the mechanism of how we're perceiving. It gives specific distorted or critical thinking errors, and then it shows how those errors affect either me being depressed and sad, me being angry, me procrastinating, problems in our relationships, right? And so it's very useful in that sense. Okay. Back to the slide. So he recognized that he was a self-aware being who could look as an observer to his experiences, so self-awareness. His identity was intact and decide how things would affect him. Between stimulus and response, he was his freedom or power to choose a response. Disciplines of mental, emotional, and moral. Using memory and imagination, he goes to these endowments. Using memory and imagination as cognitive capacities or faculties of the mind. He exercises small embryonic freedom. And what he means by embryonic here is a little ambiguous. He could be referring to the embryonic stages of growth from dependence to independence to interdependence, or he could just mean that something that grows from small to big. So it's a little hard to say specifically what he means. And then he says on slide 2, the Nazis had more liberty, meaning more options to choose from or within the environment they were in, whereas Frankl had more freedom, an internal power to exercise options. This allowed him to transcend his suffering, and central values in his life. There's experiential, creative, attitudinal. Attitudinal is the paradigm of reframing things. And we would think that the other two were listed, but it's not. And so slide 3, these endowments are self-awareness, used in between stimulus and response, the freedom to choose. So self-awareness is to think about our thought process. Imagination is the ability to create our minds beyond reality. Conscience is our deep inner awareness of right and wrong or morality. Independent will is the ability to act based on our self-awareness, free of other influences. And he gives a computer metaphor of endowments are programmed by instinct and training. We can write new programs for ourselves apart from our instincts and our training. Okay, so let's go to the text here, page 76. So he talks about the story of Viktor Frankl. He was a determinist raised in the tradition of Freudian psychology, psychoanalysis. Whatever happens to you as a child shapes your character and personality and governs your whole life. This limits the parameters of your life and are set. Basically, you can't do much about it. Frankl was a psychiatrist. I think if he was, I don't know, was he? Yeah, it may have been a psychoanalysis because Freudian is psychoanalysis, so you have to check that. He was imprisoned in the death camps in Nazi Germany. He experienced extreme atrocities. His parents, his brother, and his wife all died in the camps, or they were sent to the gas ovens. So super uncool, very not good. Page 77, except for his sister and his entire family died. Frankl himself suffered torture and indignities and never knew if he would be led to the ovens himself or if he would have to shovel the ashes of the dead people or whatever. So it's very, very difficult situation to be in. So one day he was naked and alone in a small room. He began to become aware of what he later called the last of the human freedoms. The freedom of his Nazi captors could not take away. They can control his environment. They could do what they want to his body. But Viktor Frankl himself was a self-aware being who could look at as an observer to his very involvement. His basic identity was intact. He could decide within himself how all of this was going to affect him. Between what happened to him or the stimulus and his response to it was his freedom or power to choose that response. So this is the wisdom from within this, right? In the midst of his experiences, Frankl would project himself into different circumstances. He would think about lecturing to his students after he was released from the camps. He would describe himself in the classroom in his mind's eye. He gave his students lessons he was learning during his very torture. So he would dissociate from his current experience, which is a useful tactic if you're in control of it. Through a series of such disciplines, mental, emotional, and moral, principally using memory and imagination, he exercised a small embryonic freedom until it grew larger and larger until he had more freedom than his Nazi captors. So that's why I said I'm not sure what he means by embryonic here, because it seems slightly ambiguous or an equivocation as a critical thinking fallacy, because he's using the term a little differently here than in the previous chapter. They had more liberty, more options to choose from in their environment, but he had more freedom, more internal power to exercise his options. He became an inspiration to those around him, even to some of the guards, helped them find meaning in their suffering, a dignity in their prison existence. Amidst of most of the degrading circumstances imaginable, Frankl used the human endowment of self-awareness to discover a fundamental principle of the nature of man. Between stimulus and response, humans have the freedom to choose. I try to translate so it's gender neutral. That way it's not just all man. It's like humans and people. Within the freedom to choose are those endowments that make us uniquely human. In addition to self-awareness, we have imagination, the ability to create in our minds beyond our present reality. Conscience, a deep inner awareness of right and wrong, of the principles that govern our behavior, a sense of the degree to which our thoughts and actions are in harmony with them, and independent will, the ability to act based on our self-awareness, free of other influences. So, quick side note, there is evidence that like some monkeys specifically, not chimps, they have a sense of justice or fairness, which is the underpinnings of morality. And even children show this, in the sense, I'm thinking of a different study. I was thinking of a study about cognitive dissonance because they both did it on monkeys. So the conscience part, there's evolutionary principles of how we develop a sense of morality, which is independent of like psychopathology. But non-psychopaths, humans, and people that have not been severely abused that turn into sociopaths, they generally have a sense of morality, like what's right and wrong, how to be good with the group, right? Which is good. We want that. Okay, and then imagination, it depends on how you define imagination, if you distinguish it from creativity, because elephants have painted and stuff like that, and like, you know, that kind of thing. So again, just kind of clearing up some philosophical points about this. So he says, even the most intelligent animals have none of these endowments. Again, he's being super Christian here, saying that humans are better than everything else because God said so and whatever, but there's a little bit of evidence as to the contrary. And again, there's no evidence that God exists anyways, so what are we gonna do, right? Page 78. It's true. To use a computer metaphor, they are programmed by instinct and or training. They can be trained to be responsible, but they can't take responsibility for that training. They can't change the programming. They're not aware of it, the animals. So because we're uniquely human, that we've evolved these capacities, we can write new programs for ourselves, totally apart from the instincts and training. Why an animal's capacity is relatively limited and man is unlimited. So again, it's an evolution thing. That's the best way to talk about it, you know, and there is limitations to our mental capacities. If you get brain damage, then
I heard that after age 35, you have less elasticity,
elasticity, yeah,
so you can learn faster before age 35.
for sure. It's true. So the deterministic paradigm comes primarily from the study of animals. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's what he's saying here. Neurotic and psychotic people. So I'm going to put that aside, where that's to be determined. This is 1989 at the same time, but still. So our unique human, the evolutionary capacities that make us human, I'm just going to replace that with endowment from now on, lift us up above above all the other animals. To the extent which we exercise and develop these human capacities that we've evolved, empowers us to fulfill our uniquely human potential. Between stimulus and response is our greatest power, the freedom to choose. So that's super awesome, right? And I'm just translating or swapping out some of the things that are philosophically not good, but we're going to make it stronger, right? I'm utilizing the principle of charity. How do we take what he's trying to say and make it as strong as possible, even though we have some criticisms of what's going on here, right? Okay, so we went through these things here. Now, next slide. Proactivity defined. Habit of proactivity is more than taking initiative. It is responsibility. Behavior is a function of decisions, not conditions. Subordinate feelings to value. Responsibility is responsibility, the ability to choose your response. Behavior is a product of one's own conscious choice based on values, not a product of condition based on feeling. Slide 2. Reactive people are affected by their physical and social environment. Social weather, building an emotion and lives around the behavior of others, driven by feelings, circumstances, conditions, and their environment. They subordinate impulse to value, driven by values, proactive people. Carefully thought about and selected and internalized. She gives an example of a nurse caring for an ungrateful patient, not being controlled by the treatment of another person. The character and identity does not have to be hurt. And then the last example is of a family friend named Carol who has cancer, and then she was inspiring to everybody else around her before she died. Okay, so page 78. The basic principle of the nature of man, Frankl described an accurate self-map from which he began to develop the first and most basic habit of highly effective person in any environment, the habit of proactivity. So very cool. So this is going on the principle of choosing in between stimulus and response. And based on that principle, there is a habit of being proactive, right? The word proactive is now fairly common in the world. At that time, you wouldn't find it in dictionaries, but that's not the case now. It means that as human beings, we are responsible for our own lives. Our behavior is a function of our decisions, not our conditions. Subordinate feelings to values, initiative, and the responsibility to make things happen. So it's not just about planning. And some people can see being proactive as I just have a planner and I follow the planner. But it's about the stimulus response. It's about not being reactive to all the things that can affect you, but taking control and having agency on anything that will affect you. That's what being proactive is. So it's way broader than just, I have planned to do this next week, right? So at the bottom of 78, the word responsibility, okay, we talked about that. Okay, so next. So the freedom to choose. So another diagram here. Can we see this on the thing? So the freedom to choose. He talks about stimulus response in between that. And to have freedom to choose, we utilize these 4 capacities of the mind: self-awareness, imagination, conscience, and independent will. So
It reminds me, if I can interrupt, just to add something, I
Yeah.
acknowledge
yep,
how a lot of people say, like, oh, control your emotions, control basically your emotions, where I disagree with that. It's like you can feel the emotion, which is like the energy in motion, but you can't control that, but you can control how you respond to that emotion. Like, you can feel angry,
Yeah.
but you don't have to exert angry actions.
yeah, for sure. That's what we're trying to do, right? And from a psychological standpoint, there is a limitation that humans have physiologically. Like, you can only process so much cortisol, the hormone, the stress hormone, every day. And if you're consistently, this is something that I do, I just fucking make myself too stressed out all the time. If you have too much cortisol all the time, it will reduce the independent will thing, your willpower. And so part of being proactive is like, and I would say being wise, as to not put yourself through very difficult things that are just you're not gonna be able to do it, right? So there's something called the overconfidence bias, that some things might be very challenging and difficult, and we need to kind of know our limitations. Or when we like go to the principle of know thyself, right? The Oracle of Delphi and Socrates. And so knowing thyself is in some ways knowing our limitations. Now, at the same time, like with what you're saying, Dimitri, I think it's valuable for us to be aware of those emotions and then decide how to respond to them, right? But we're human, and sometimes if you're in a fucking difficult situation, it might be really difficult to deal with it. Like it's just, like
Sometimes it's addictive. It's a habit. It's a bad habit.
yeah. So we would want
Of course.
to be aware of that and then structure a new pattern of living. And this is something that I got to do, for sure, right? This is like too stressed out sometimes. What do you think, Dimitri? Is that good?
That's amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so page 79. So we see this stimulus, response, freedom to choose, right? And everybody that's listening online, they're like, I've already bought the book. There's no copyright issues or anything like that because we're paying the author the money, So, and this is I think we avoid those problems because this is an educational context, right? Not really making money off this. So we are by nature proactive. Is this true? We can talk about it. If our lives are a function of conditioning and conditions, it's because we have, by conscious decision or by default, chosen to empower those things that control us. So that's a pretty good statement right there to talk about, right? I think by nature, we have the capacity to be proactive. But if it was an instinct, like vision, like you just see, right? You wouldn't have to talk about being proactive because you'd just be doing it all the time. So the fact that we have to talk about it means that there's a capacity, like I can get strong, but I have to work out to be able to lift the weight. I'm not just like ripped when I come out of the womb, just like a little jack baby, like, whoa, where'd this baby come from, right? Where'd this proactive person come from? Well, they learned it, right? Why? Because they have the capacity, right? Like judging distance. Like you don't just know how far 10 feet is away. You kind of judge it. And if you're a carpenter and you measure it out, you get better at judging distance, right? So being proactive, we have a capacity to be proactive, but it is something that it's a habit that you're going to learn and you're going to get better at it, right?
Can you give a short definition of proactive?
Being proactive is choosing how the things affect you. The things affect you are the stimulus, and being proactive is deciding your response. That's at least his definition of being proactive. Right? And then the way that we utilize this freedom to choose is with these 4 mental capacities here. Self-awareness. You can imagine stuff like Viktor Frankl was imagining being in class and teaching stuff. You have a sense of conscience. You're like, I'm going to choose to be a good person. And you have independent will. I'm going to take action here. I'm going to do something. And making such a choice We become reactive if we respond based on our conditioning. Reactive people are often affected by their physical environment. And again, me teaching this stuff is so that you guys can tell me, Achilles, you're being reactive right now in the right way. So that I, be right. It's for everybody. No, it's not about me knowing everything. It's about just having like a healthy.
Proactive
Yes.
is preventing potential problems.
Okay. That's very good.
It's a good one too.
That's wise.
That's proactive.
Okay. And where's that from?
Dictionary,
Cool. Very good.
preventing potential problems. And
Can you
the opposite is responding to it after it happened.
can you repeat the definition, please?
She said preventing potential problems.
Is the definition of being proactive?
Yes.
Huh.
That's the dictionary definition. The Stephen Covey definition is the choosing the response. So on page 79. Okay, so reactive people, in contrast, on page 79, things affect them and they just go with that. Proactive people carry their own weather with them. Whether it rains or shines makes no difference. They're value driven. If their values is to produce good quality work, it's not a function of whether they do or not. Reactive people are also affected by their social environment. If people treat them well, they feel well. When they don't, they become defensive or protective. Reactive people build their emotional lives around the behavior of others, empowering the weaknesses of other people to control them. So again, this is like a habit of how to relate to people too, right? The ability to subordinate an impulse to a value is the essence of the proactive person. That's like a principle right there. Page 79. The ability to subordinate an impulse to a value is the essence of the proactive person. Reactive people are driven by feelings, by circumstances, by conditions, by their environment. Proactive people are driven by values, carefully thought about, selected, and internalized values. Proactive people are still influenced by external stimuli, whether it's physical, social, or psychological. Their response to the stimuli is conscious or unconscious. It's value-based choice or response. Page 80. He gives this quote by Roosevelt, "No one can hurt you without your consent." And then another one from Gandhi, "They cannot take away our self-respect if we do not give it to them. It's our willing permission, our consent to what happens to us that hurts us far more than what happens to us in the first place." So our cognitions, how we interpret what's going on, and the story we tell ourselves, right? It's very hard to accept emotionally, especially if we've had years and years of explaining our misery in the name of circumstance or someone else. Until a person can say deeply and honestly, "I am what I am today because of the choices I made yesterday," the person cannot say, "I choose otherwise." So we have to have this paradigm shift as he would communicate it, right? I'm always trying to explain it in his terms, unless we have to have an external philosophizing moment here. So he talks about this day he was speaking on the subject of productivity in California. Some woman in the audience stood up. Now he goes into an example. So he's kind of lecturing. This is what it is. Now he's like, here's a personal example. Woman stood up and she was like talking and super excited. She realized that she was kind of having a social outburst, so she sat back down. But she was still so excited she had to talk to people around her. So at the break, he went up to her and he's like, "Hey, like, what happened to you?" And she's like, "You can't imagine what happened. I'm a full-time nurse. I'm dealing with this miserable, ungrateful man. Nothing I do is good enough for him. He doesn't ever show appreciation. He hardly acknowledges me. He's always getting upset, blah, 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 right? He's making my life miserable. And then I take my frustrations out on my family. All the other nurses feel the same way. And as I'm sitting here listening to you talk about being proactive, you have the nerve to tell me that it's my choice to be upset or not?" She's like, "Who do you think you are?" kind of thing. She has a talk to Stephen Covey, right? "No one can hurt me without my consent." What is this? "And that I've chosen my own emotional life of being miserable. There's no way I could buy into it." But then I kept thinking about it. I went really inside myself and began to ask, do I have the power to choose my response? Right? When I finally realized I do have the power, when I swallowed that bitter pill and realized that I have chosen to be miserable, I also realized I could choose not to be. At that moment, I stood up. I felt that I was being lifted out, page 81, and went to yell at the whole world, "I'm free. I'm let out of prison. No longer am I going to be controlled by the treatment of some other person." So that's beautiful, right? And now this experience may happen when we're not super tired and super stressed out. But when the brain's fatigued, it's harder to be like that. So that's why you got to manage your life. Don't put yourself in environments where it's going to be hard for you, right? But still, we have this capacity. We can be like this, you know, and we can get better at it.
How can you increase that? The mental fatigue, like your capacity.
You got to keep on practicing it, and then you'll be able to do it with less capacity over time. But it's important to acknowledge that certain circumstances or contexts will be very, very difficult. Or if
So
you're
it's
like
like a
super
muscle.
tired, for example,
Read this book.
read this book. That's a good suggestion.
That's a perfect one.
Very good. Okay.
In some workplaces, they give you training about this, how to deal with patients.
Mhm,
We're not supposed to take it personally.
mhm. We have two people here that are either working or are going to work in healthcare. It's true. These are both of you guys. Okay, next. 81. So it's not what happens to us, but our response to what happens to us that hurts us. Things can hurt us physically or economically and cause sorrow. Our character, our basic identity, so he's equating character with identity here, does not have to be hurt at all. Like who I am. Because who I am is not a condition of what happens to me, but what I do to, or however I react or respond to it. This is another principle he says, our most difficult experiences become the crucibles that forge our character and develop the internal powers, those four things he talked about before, the freedom to handle difficult circumstances in the future and to aspire others to do so as well. Frankl was able to develop his personal freedom in different circumstances to lift and inspire others. Another example is the autobiographical accounts of Vietnam prisoners. One thing that's lacking from this is like a reference. Like when he talks about these autobiographical principles, if this was an academic text, there'd be a little number there. And then they would show you a journal article and you could read it. So whatever, like, but that's the thing. Prisoners of war, they have a persuasive testimony of the transforming power of their personal freedom and the effective responsible use of that freedom in prison culture and the prisoners. So, because we're just taking this as an anecdotal justification, which is not a valid justification technically. So we all know individuals in very difficult circumstances, like someone with a terminal illness or a physical handicap, and they're managing these emotional situations. Nothing has a greater long-lasting impression upon another person than the awareness that someone else has transcended suffering, has transcended circumstance, and is embodying and expressing a value that inspires and ennobles and lifts life. So next we go into this example of a family friend named Carol, who had cancer, and she was in her last stages of the terminal illness. And then his wife, Sandra, was helping her write a personal history. And she wouldn't take, she wrote little stories for her kids as they grew older. So when they got to be like 15 or graduate high school, there was like a letter from her mother, even though she died many years previously. So that was nice. And that's her being proactive. She wouldn't take pain-killing medication, so she had access to her mental and emotional faculties. And yeah, so page 82. And Carol's story is very, it motivates people and they like it. So then he talks to his group about any other people that they've experienced that were terminally ill that had this sense of like appreciation for life. And those people were transformed by these individuals. Viktor Frankl suggests that there are three central values in life: experiential, no, not yet. Experiential, where are we here? That which happens to us, the creative, that's what we bring into existence, and the attitudinal, our response to difficult circumstances like a terminal illness. He states, my own experience with people confirms the point of Viktor Frankl. The highest of the three values is attitudinal in the paradigm or reframing sense. What matters most is how we respond to what we experience in life. And that's what he means by being proactive, our response. Difficult circumstances often create paradigm shifts, whole new frames of reference by which people see the world and themselves and others in it. What life is asking of them. The larger perspective reflects the attitudinal values that lift and inspire us all. Okay, next slide. Taking initiative. The basic nature is to act, not be acted upon. We choose our response. We create circumstances. Recognizing responsibility to make things happen. Solutions to problems, not problems themselves. Resourcefulness and initiative, R&I, that's his way of saying this. Holding people responsible is affirming, not demeaning. So page 82 at the bottom. Our basic nature is to act, not be acted upon. Enabling us to choose our response to particular circumstances empowers us to create those circumstances. Taking initiative does not mean being pushy, obnoxious, or aggressive. It means recognizing our responsibility to make things happen. So he goes through an example of counseling people who wanted to show more initiative in their job, taking interest in aptitude tests. They study problems, page 83. How they can develop effective presentations, showing their abilities, how to solve organizational problems. He's discussing this as solution selling. It's a paradigm in the business success. The response is usually agreement. Most people can see how an approach would affect their opportunities for employment and advancement, but they fail to take the necessary steps, the initiative to make it happen. So he's like, I don't know where to go to take the interest in aptitude tests. How do I study industry and organizational problems? No one wants to help me. I don't have any idea how to make an effective presentation. So just, I don't know, being successful in business, whatever. Many people wait for something to happen or someone to take care of them. People who end up with good jobs are the proactive ones who are solutions to problems, not problems themselves, who sees the initiative to do whatever is necessary, consistent with correct principles to get the job done. Whenever someone in our family, even kids, takes an irresponsible position and waits for someone else to make things happen, I tell them, use your R&I, your resourcefulness and initiative. Holding people responsible is not demeaning, it's affirming. Proactivity is part of human nature. Proactive muscles may be dormant, but they're there. By respecting the proactive nature of other people, we provide them with at least one clear, undistorted reflection from the social mirror. The maturity level of the individual has to be taken into account. Can't expect high creative cooperation from those who are deeply in deep emotional dependence. We can affirm their basic nature and create an atmosphere where people can seize opportunities and solve problems in an increasingly self-reliant way. So that's good. Okay, next. I know you're getting tired. I'm just going through it.
And I have a question. Is proactivity really the key to success when it's really environment and like circumstantial? Like say, for example, someone is like forced to pay back like debts to their family, like through slavery, like in Congo and other places. Okay. So their version of being proactive is to put themselves in a negative cycle or a situation to try and solve it, and having that lack of education to know how to change their situation properly. So like is proactivity really like important when it's largely environmental and educational?
So he would give the example of, you had the Viktor Frankl example when he was in concentration camp, and even though he was being tortured and people were dying around him, the way he perceived the situation, or like his capacity to dissociate slightly when he was being tortured or whatever, that he had his own independent free will in that moment, right? So even if you were your family is putting you into slavery, he would argue at the least, if your environment means you can't physically move, you can interpret things differently, right? At another level, you could try to like escape. You know, you do have that capacity. We have to look at specific situations here and see how realistic that is. But that would be his, at the very, like he gives the Viktor Frankl example because the guy couldn't get out of the camp, right? And he was like in a cell and being tortured and stuff. And even in that environment, he talks about the independent will, is that you choose, you still have the capacity to choose what to do with your mind. They can't control your mind, is what he's trying to say. At the very basic minimum level, that things from the environment are occurring that you can't control, and you can choose how to respond to them.
What about propaganda or like beliefs from higher ups put on society? Wouldn't that be a form of mind control?
It would be, and that's why we have the Philosophy Society. That's why being philosophical is so important, so we can be mindful of advertisement or other unconscious efforts to change and control our minds, and then we can engage in our critical thinking skills. Now that's a value, and you would really need to have that value first to apply it in life, right? And so that's why doing this as a social group, because when I say the Philosophy Society, I mean like a wise group of people, and a wise group of people would be mindful of this. So I think it's important to talk about capacity, like I said before. is that being proactive is not like an instinct, it's a capacity we have that through developing specific habits of response, we can be more proactive. So in your example of the advertising stuff, there's going to be a certain way to utilize critical thinking and mindfulness to increase our capacity of being proactive towards that stuff, right? But at the same time, you're right, there's going to be implicit influences on our judgments that will affect how we think about things. And that's not really in our control so much. So what I do sometimes is like when an ad comes on YouTube, I mute it, I scroll it up so I can only see the bar and I don't even perceive the ad. I've been doing that for years. I hate advertisement. I hate it. Ever since I was like 7, I hated it. I was like, they're doing the same thing as the religious people. I was like, no, I don't want this. Indoctrinating, right? It's just like economic indoctrination.
Even with the news too, I'd say.
I'm sorry?
Even with some news channels, I'd say.
Yeah. And so that's where like the culture and a social group of being philosophical is super important. And that's why I spend so much time doing this. Because because of exactly what you're saying. It is the only response, I think, to that. Right? And if most people were like that, I think that paradigm or sociocultural value set would change. Because we're kind of inoculated to it now. It doesn't work the same way. Or people just don't look at it. We're like, we're not going to do it. But part of the problem is that advertising, like people spend a lot of money on advertising. Like one of the biggest problems with X, or formerly known as Twitter, was that most of the advertisers were backing out of their contracts with Elon Musk because of certain things, right? And that can ruin a company like that. Or Facebook is predominantly, and Instagram runs on advertising fees. So I think that there's like ethical advertising, like knowing that it has these implicit effects on the mind. What are we going to allow people to do, you know? And on one side, there's like disinformation. And on the other side, there's accurate, justified data, you know? And so, yeah, that's a discussion. Good? Cool. Yes.
It starts with gratitude prayer.
Okay.
So you do what you can. That's how, you know, wherever you are in the Congo or anywhere, you do what you can.
And a way to
First,
be proactive.
Yeah.
That's good.
with that prayer, you know, it's inside,
What's the gratitude prayer?
to know the difference.
Oh, the serenity prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So in some ways, it's like I can't change that I have like iron cuffs on me or whatever, and I can't do that, but I can at least have some positive relation to the capacity that I can with this person who's controlling me in this moment. But if there's an opportunity to like revolt and like rise against this context of slavery, then me and the people will do that. And that's not just in that specific issue with the Congo. It could be North Korea. It could be Iran and how women are severely abused. And that like 2 years ago, that girl was killed by the Iranian police or whatever. And the woman life freedom was almost a revolution to take down the Iranian regime, right? And then Russia and Ukraine, same thing, right? Or Putin's Kremlin utilizing the Russian people against Ukraine, which is super not cool, right? And so this is like a political science discussion in some ways, or a social psychological discussion combined. Is how do we have large systems of government or social contexts where people can be free and not be coerced either in slavery or in a oligarchy fascist regime, right? Whether it's religious or not. And that's important. And I would say that part of it is the critical thinking self-awareness part, which the Philosophy Society can do. But then there's going to be like a military action thing that we don't really have to do that here in Canada, at least not right now. But in certain areas, it's a real thing, right?
So to break it down one further, what is the definition of success? Because other people might think of like having a lot of finances, like having a lot of capital is a form of success.
Yeah, well, there's values, right? Like happiness and money can be values, but success would be like you have a goal and you have accomplished the criteria for the goal. And so if the goal is to be happy and you accomplish happiness, then you're successful. If the goal is to get a coffee and I get a coffee, I'm successful. So success and meaning in life are like two different things.
Accomplishment.
Yeah.
Mm.
What were you saying?
I was gonna say, like, it seems like a lot of countries over time, like, even like going back to ancient civilizations, there's always been like corrupt governments, and it just seems in human nature where humans use power and control for satisfaction, and that ends up hurting the general population. So if that's the case, then, and it's been so unchanging over time, what is even the point of philosophy?
Yeah, well, I think that is the point. Is like, is it came out of that. It's that the powerful in nature usually win out, whether it's one individual that's stronger or a group that outnumbers. And it's not just philosophy, it's like the social contract. It's that we, over time, have developed the point where we have human rights and we have a civilization or a society, a certain normative society that says that the people are what matter and each individual has these rights. And we've kind of built this democratic state in contrast to the king is the only one that matters and they can do whatever they want. And they have this right of divinity because they're appointed by God in some ways.
They
That-
know that.
yeah, they're infallible like the Pope.
They know.
But it's not actually true. No human being has that capacity, right? And so, like, again, what I'm doing as a philosophy study is a different thing. It's like a social movement in contrast to like writing philosophy and reading Plato. Now, Plato wrote the Republic. What I'm doing is a little bit different. You could argue that I'm trying to teach people to be philosopher kings, and I'm kind of cool with that. You talk about that. But, you know, there are some things to discuss, like Socrates incited like 30 tyrants because, you know, they all became like, I don't know, narcissistically emboldened, and then they, you know, caused a lot of destruction and stuff like that. So we don't want that outcome. And so my response is basically like, I believe if we look at society like a game, right? A game is like an objective, and then there's rules and parameters that keep everybody within that context, which is another way to say society. The game needs to be structured such that it directly opposes the outcomes you're identifying, right? That way, it removes the possibility of these things occurring. So that's where it's like, I start from the individual and we teach the properties of self-awareness as like the first thing, one of the first things, and critical thinking. And there has to be this mechanism of discussion between the individuals where you learn how to criticize me, right? And that necessarily makes me not become in power or in control in an illegitimate way. There are moments where we do want somebody to have power because they're just going to do the right thing. Like maybe if I leave the house, you know, like I'm not at home right now, so that my dog's there and my cat. And if there was a fire, I would want someone to have the power to open the door to let them out and maybe take care of them, like put the dog on a leash, for example.
Also, like years ago, education didn't exist,
Mhm.
schools didn't exist, so people needed guidance. They needed kings, they needed authority, they needed maybe to be slaves.
Yeah, I don't know about the last
Even
point.
now, some countries don't have schools for women.
Yeah, I think we have to, like, this is like a political, socio-political discussion, right? I think the first thing is to identify what rights can we universalize. That's like, which is human rights. That's the first thing. And then how do we establish an institution or like a social organization with policy and people that have interchangeable roles within that? And the institution goes on. So like when someone leaves, they just get replaced with someone who functions within that context. And that is the mechanism that teaches people how to function within society. That's kind of the purpose of education, as we're not born with these things as instincts. Our instincts are like my ability to like pay attention and listen, and then I can synthesize information and comprehend it. But what is the information? You know, like the tyrant just says, I'm not going to give you information. I'm going to take it away. And then I can just control you and turn you into a slave. Well, that's not good, right? It's not because it's not founded upon human nature in the sense that humans function better when they can learn without threat. Right? If there's threat, then you like get your fight or flight systems engaged, and then it's hard to focus. Your attention is fragmented because you're like, do I have to run away from this thing that's going to kill me all the time? And so we want our prefrontal cortex and our limbic system to not be activated in that way, and our prefrontal cortex to be able to be open and process information and understand its environment. And so we want an institution that enables that in people, right? And so the problem, so if you go through the previous like lectures from this past year, whenever you have time, I talk about this stuff and then we can talk about it some more once you see the things I've said before. I'm just kind of summarizing it all as fast as I can. And yeah, and so we know that there are forces in humans and in society. The force of the human is our capacity for conscious awareness and our ability to have habits and learn things. And then social groups have this socialization function that we instill habits within each other and we feel we're accepted and stuff. And then it can become a bad thing, like in Milgram's experiments or in the Holocaust, right? But it can also be a good thing in the context of like a hospital runs very effectively and they take care of people and stuff like that, right? As an institution or just a general university or whatever. And so we want to have the same methodology, but not like the difference between the university is about publication. You know, it's about doing research. You read only papers within your specific field, however many they are, and then you publish one on top, and then someone publishes another one. It just keeps on building like that, right? We need like a practice of living, analogous to religion, but religion is not the answer. If it was, we wouldn't have problems, and we still do. And so there needs to be some way that it's not an appeal to God. That's the authority thing. An appeal to some higher force or power, whether it's Putin, Kim Jong-un or whatever, like Xi Jinping, like a person, or some entity, like the flying spaghetti monster, you know, Richard Dawkins joke, or like Scientology with like the aliens that come down and like whatever, the e-meters and stuff like that. Like there's craziness out there, things that coherently don't make sense, right? We really just need to have the ideal of like a better world, like a utopia. And even if it's unachievable, because it's an ideal, we can approach it like a limit. You never actually cross the line, but you get really, really close to it. And that's good enough, like from practical purposes, you know, like 300 years ago or 500 years ago, if you said that like healthcare was a thing and women can be doctors or whatever, in many areas of the world, they'd be like, you're crazy. That's never going to be possible. Or we're going to have flying cars, you know, or we're going to go on the moon. Like actually, they would just say you're insane and they'd like burn you at the stake or something like that, right? And so it is like when we evaluate these things, so and when we use the philosophy of science here to evaluate theories, which theory is better, right? We can say, are there any internal contradictions in what we're saying, right? If there is, it doesn't make sense. Like if we had like the homeopathy society, we say, well, wait a minute, homeopathy from the bat doesn't make any sense. Why? Because it contradicts all chemistry and physics. It doesn't make sense to have molecular memory, that this molecule is copying itself. Like we've never even seen this before. Like you're saying something that is not factual. What I'm trying to communicate is something that is based on phenomena we can already see in social groups. We're just changing the content and creating a social structure that is similar to other social structures. It just doesn't have the Bible, for example. We can read it, but we're going to utilize philosophical analysis to say, hey, this is a violation of human rights. Maybe this is not a good thing to do, right? But the principle of being good to your neighbor, sure. As long as you just don't like exclude Muslims and Jews and Hindus. Everybody's your neighbor. So we still have to put it into context, right? And just the way that it's structured, I think we're using forces of human nature just directed in a certain way that will necessarily exclude like psychopaths from taking advantage of people. And the way we do that is we give people the capacity to be aware of how psychopaths manipulate individuals and then how to call them on their behavior. Like if there was like 5 properties of I'm just hypothetically, of psychopathology or narcissism or Machiavellianism, like the third triad, and you know, you taught everybody how to identify those things and then to have some social sanction to say, hey, you know, you're lying right now. And this is the evidence. And narcissists or people with low cognitive capacity will have ways to respond to that and try to avoid it, right? But then you just say, hey, until you conform, we're going to use conformity in a good way, to these normative practices of being a good person, you're not allowed to participate in this way, or you're not allowed to do this or do that or whatever it is, right? And what else are we going to do? Like, we can just give up, sure, but I'm not going to do that. I am not going to do that. I'm going to continue to try this out until it works, you know? And I think that one main criticism is it won't work for everybody, but the people that can learn, the people that do have the capacity to absorb it and internalize it and become stronger, let's just teach all of those people then. Like, what's the ratio? Like, let's say it was 60% of the population. That's a lot. Or 40%, or even 20%. I just give the analogy of the Jedi and the Sith. It only takes one Jedi to like deal with like 100 bad guys or 100 bad people, right? So let's train all the Jedis then. It's fine with me. It's better than none, you know? And when you have people like currently, like there's, you know, like, again, like the Israel-Palestine thing, Palestine-Israel is like inherently a religious problem based on territory, right? And then there's like this tit for tat back and forth, you know, aggression kind of a thing. And so like, first you have to like philosophize out the religious stuff. You're going to have to deal with that. And then anyone that deviates from that, you'd have to just go back to like, no, this is what's really going on here, right? But the blind faith in God and the scripture that follows, it kind of leads to problems like that. Like, what else are you going to do? You know? Whereas like Putin's different. It's strictly like political, quote unquote. Like Putin's not like, he's not, he's talking about this Nazi stuff, which is craziness. But it's not like he's saying that like, my God is better than yours. Or I have like an interpretation of jihad, which enables me to kill people and do horrendous things to them. It's not that. It's liberating like the Soviet Union, or bringing it back to what he thought it used to be. Right? And whatever justifications he uses, probably just wants to have control over that whole area because it's an entire port. And economically, his country would be increased because he does not Ukraine in the way. He owns that whole area of Odessa to like, Crimea and then Odessa. And then there's like this whole other, I forget what it's called, but to the east side of that area of the Black Sea. It just makes sense from a territorial standpoint to own that area. And he's justifying the means as an end. He's like, well, if the end is to own this, I'm just going to kill my way there. And once I own it, then I can ship stuff through and it'll increase my economy by whatever. You know what I mean? Like, that's super plausible. But you're fucking violating a whole bunch of stuff to get to that end. When you could just have like a really awesome trade relation with Ukraine, not being perceived as a fascist or act like one, you know, and you're good to go. Right? Or even the belief about the Soviet Union, like that mentality, we need to philosophize that. Like, was it even good? Like the Russians taking over Siberia when the fur trade was going on, like a few hundred years ago, like, was that even justified? And so the threat of violence in any country to maintain the sovereignty of that country is almost always a problem. Right? So like the big part of current Russia, like Siberia, wanted to be their own nation, and they voted such that they have the right to do that. I think that they have the right to do that. And for the existing Russian state to utilize force through violence to maintain its state is wrong. The only time you can utilize force is in self-defense in some ways. It can be proactive. Like, I see trucks coming in with guns, or there's people coming into my lawn with guns to rob me. You can be proactive in that sense, right? You don't have to wait for people to.
Just a minor,
Thanks. You don't have to wait for people to attack you to respond to it. You know what I mean? But to use violence to maintain an idea that doesn't even make sense, that violates one of those properties of the philosophy of science. It's not coherent, right? And so that's why the academic philosophy is still important in the practical philosophy, because it's the underpinning of how we make sense of things. But then there's how we live together, which is like a practice part. And we're just going to have to do it together. It's not about one person. It's just that after almost 20 years of studying and doing stuff, I was like, this is the answer. I think this is the answer, you know? And so I'm just committed to that now, right? And so it's up to you guys to learn some things and then contribute in your own way. You have to be your own independent agent and figure out what to do, you know? And so we're doing this book just because there's things in this book that are valuable, like being proactive and all the other stuff. But often, like for the past year, it's been like an open discussion of me discussing the nature of what the Philosophy Society is and what are the properties of it on an individual level, a social level, and whatever else, you know? And you can watch that stuff. And yeah, and that's basically just like practice for the book that I will write that will be called the Philosophy Society. And it's basically like a manual on how to run it yourself, you know? But I think that there are books that will teach us how to have well-being and how to live well. And this is one of them. Feeling Good was another one. A book about mindfulness is important, right? And then all this stuff just kind of connects together. It's coherent. It's not contradicting itself. And when I observe a contradiction, I use my academic skills to help us understand it, our critical thinking skills. The next book we're going to do is probably that critical thinking book, just because. It's a free PDF. I'll send it in the group again. And yeah, okay, so sorry. What do you think?
Yeah, that answers my question. That makes sense.
Okay. That answers the question. Good. Okay. We have half an hour left. How much more do I have left here? We're making progress here. Maybe we have to do this over the course of 2 days, though. Yeah. Act or be acted upon. So initiative to create production capability balance. That's a topic from the previous section. Proactive question, what is our response? Proactivity is facing reality, which is different than positive thinking. Power to choose positive response to circumstances and projections. So let's look at the bottom of 83. The difference between people who exercise initiative and those who don't is literally the difference between night and day. So either like he's saying there's top of 84, there's a huge difference between the two. Yeah, in taking initiative. It takes initiative, to create the production capability balance of effectiveness in your life. It takes initiative to develop the 7 habits. As you study the 6 other habits, you will see that each depends on the development of your proactive muscles. Each puts the responsibility on you to act. If you wait to be acted upon, you will be acted upon. Growth and opportunity consequences attend each other road. So he gives an example of work with people in the home improvement industry, representatives from 20 different organizations. They come together and they discuss their profits and problems and stuff. It was a heavy recession. It had a negative impact on this industry. It was heavier on them than others in the economy in general. They were very discouraged. So they had a 3-day seminar. So on the first day, their discussion question was, what is happening to us? What's the stimulus? Many things were happening. The environmental pressures were powerful. There was lots of unemployment. They had layoffs. Everyone was very discouraged. The second day, the question was, what's going to happen in the future? They studied environmental trends with the underlying reactive assumption that those things would create their future. By the end of the second day, they were even more depressed. Things were going to get worse before they got better. On the third day, they decided to use a proactive approach. What is our response? What are we going to do? How can we exercise initiative in the situation? They talked about managing and reducing costs. They talked about increasing market share. They brainstormed both areas and concentrated on several practical, doable things. They had excitement, hope, and a proactive awareness. At the end of the third day, they summarized the results of the conference in a 3-part answer. How's business? Part 1, what's happening to us is not good. The trend suggests that it will get worse before it gets better, the top of 85. Part 2, what we are causing to happen is very good. We are better managing and reducing our costs and increasing our market share. Part 3, because of the context and our response, business is better than ever. Now, what would a reactive mind say? Face the facts. Positive thinking will only get you so far. You have to face reality. The difference between positive thinking and proactivity is that they did face reality. They faced reality of the current circumstance and the future projections. They faced reality that they had the power to choose a positive response to those circumstances and projections. Not facing reality would have been to accept the idea that what's happening in our environment had to determine us. Business, community groups, organizations of every kind, including families, can be proactive. They can combine, so in proactive, it's the choice to have a positive outlook, right? They can combine creativity and resourcefulness of proactive individuals to create a proactive culture within the organization. The organization does not have to be at the mercy of the environment. Take the initiative to accomplish the shared values and purposes of the individuals involved. Okay, next slide. Listening to our language. An awareness of language to reveal paradigms. Proactive language versus deterministic language. The transfer of responsibility. Reactive language becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Produce evidence to support the belief. Blame outside forces for the situation. The example of love, there's the feeling of love, which is the reward, the fruit. Reactive people make it the feeling. Proactive people make it a verb, something that you do. A value actualized through actions to subordinate feelings to values. So our attitudes and behaviors flow out of our paradigms. If we use our self-awareness to examine them, we can often see in them the nature of our underlying maps. Our language is a very real indicator of the degree to which we ourselves are proactive people. The language of reactive people absolves them of responsibility. That's me. That's just the way I am. I am determined. There's nothing I can do. He makes me so mad. I'm not responsible. My emotional life is governed by something outside my control. I can't do it. I don't have the time. Something outside me, limited time, is controlling me. If only my wife were more patient. Someone else's behavior is limiting my effectiveness. Page 86. I have to do it. Circumstances or other people are forcing me to do what to do. I'm not free to choose my own actions. So we have a little table here. Reactive language and proactive language. So for reactive language, he says, there's nothing I can do. The proactive view is, let's look at our alternatives. To be reactive, it's just the way I am. To be proactive, I can choose a different approach. Reactive, he makes me so mad. Proactive, I control my own feelings. Reactive, they won't allow that. Proactive, I create an effective presentation. Reactive,
something
sorry?
before you go on.
Yep.
For the proactive language thing, there's this other book called Mind Power by Robert Kehoe.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his key rules of for your way of thinking is to eliminate the word can't, not, won't from your dictionary completely.
Yeah, okay.
Just a little side note. Thank you.
That's good. This section is really good for supplementing David Burns, because David Burns, he just says think of a rational response, but doesn't really go too much into it when you get to that. And this is great for that. It gives us more tools on how to create, using the proactive language, a rational response, right? Okay, so you can read the rest of those. Language comes from our basic paradigm of determinism if we're reactive. The whole spirit of it is the transfer of responsibility. I am not responsible, not able to choose my response. And he gives this example of a student who wants to be excused from class to go on a tennis trip. He's like, well, do you have to go or are you choosing to go? He's like, oh, I have to. And then he switches to the frame of what are the consequences of this, right? He's like, well, what would happen if you don't? They'll kick me off the team. How would you like that consequence? I wouldn't. You choose to go because you want the consequences of staying on the team. What will happen if you miss my class? I don't know. What do you think will be the natural consequence of not coming to class? You wouldn't kick me out. That would be a social consequence, artificial. If you don't participate in the tennis team, you don't play. That's natural. But if you don't come to class, what would be the natural consequence? I'd miss the learning. You'd have to weigh the consequence against other consequences and make a choice. I know if it were me, I'd choose to go on the tennis trip, but I'd never say you have to do anything. I choose to go on the tennis trip and miss my class, and then he laughed. So page 87 at the top. A serious problem with reactive language is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People become reinforced in the paradigm that they are determined. They produce evidence to support the belief. They feel increasingly victimized and out of control, not in charge of their life or their destiny. They blame outside forces, people, circumstances, and even the stars of their own situation. So he's doing a seminar, the concept of proactivity. A man came up and said, every situation is so difficult. Look at my marriage. My wife and I don't have the same feelings. We don't love each other anymore. What do we do? He says, well, the feeling is not there anymore. We have 3 children and we're concerned. What do you suggest? He says, love her. But the feeling's not there. He says, well, love her. He said, the feeling of love just isn't there. Love her. The feeling isn't there. That's a good reason to love her. How do you love when you don't love? Love is a verb, the feeling, the fruit of love, the verb. Love her. And he says, serve her and sacrifice. I don't agree with those things. I think there needs to be a different context for relationships. But listen to her, empathize, appreciate, affirm. Are you willing to do that? Those are good. I think there's something to be said about the love thing, we can talk about that in a different context, but I don't think it's just necessarily only the verb. because serving somebody and sacrificing is not 100% what it means to have a healthy relationship, right? It's about growth and having a complementary sense. And sometimes maybe commitment or other values are more important than the temporary feeling of like infatuation, whatever that might be.
Well, serve and sacrifice, it took the heavy turn. You just maybe not a good verbs here.
Yeah, I think we could think of other things, but there's some philosophizing about this relationship. I think what he's just trying to say is be proactive. Yeah.
I watched this really good indie movie. It's like an animated movie from Latvia, and it goes through the relationships and like the life of this like young woman. And her first one was very abusive. So her husband would always like tell her that he loved her when he would cheat on her. And she left him, and the last thing that she said before she left him was, "Love is just a word to you." And I thought it was pretty cool.
Interesting. The way we act is what's important, right? And how we treat somebody. And I think that has to do with like putting effort in and caring about somebody are things that you can choose to do. And that's a reflection of loving the person. But love as a term, I think, is like Sartre talks about object transcendence, that there's this ideal notion of what this person means to you, and relating to them is like, it's like a relationship. It's a vessel that gets you somewhere, or he uses the term enterprise. And if that person, you can't identify with their ideal state, there just might be nothing in that relationship, i.e. you fall out of love. Or some people, I've talked about this before, some people are identifying with a person, but not looking at the reality of how they're acting, right? So if they're being abusive, they're not accepting that that's part of what the person is, or they're just neglectful, and they're in love with this ideal thing, but they're not saying, hey, this is actually what this really is. And so communicating is important. And sometimes it might just be the case that your growth is not going to occur in this context. And that's where self-love is more important than other love. You don't have the other without the self. You need to love yourself more, which doesn't mean being selfish. It just means understanding what is best for you. And then that will be best for the kids too, whatever that is. So again, he can't divorce anybody because he's Christian, right? So he has to stay in this relationship. But maybe some relationships aren't good, right? And we need to figure that out. What does it really mean? But I think that the notion of what love is we can talk about that. That's important, right? Okay. So he's talking about the 87, literature of progressive societies, love is a verb. Reactive people make love the feeling. Okay. We can understand his paradigm here. Driven by feelings. Hollywood has scripted us to believe that we're not responsible, product of our feelings. The Hollywood script does not describe reality, our feelings of control, to control our actions, because we have abdicted our responsibility and empowered them to do so. Proactive people make love a verb. Love is something you do. Sacrifices you make, the giving of self, like a mother bringing a newborn into the world. If you want to study love, study those who sacrifice for others, even for people who do not offend or do not love in return. If you're a parent, look at the love you have for the children you sacrifice for. Love is a value that is actualized through loving actions. Proactive people subordinate feelings to the values. Love, the feeling can be recaptured. Well, I don't know if that's true. Someone could just exploit you and take advantage of you and just cheat on you and lie to you and stuff like that. And you're devoting yourself to them and being a servant, but that's not really good for you, right? So I think first we have to define what love is. And Sartre's definition of love, I think, is very useful here in general.
I'm going to interrupt there.
Yep.
Where you said how it's not very useful for you. Back on page 81, it did say, in fact, our most difficult experiences become the crucibles that forge our character and develop the internal powers of freedom to handle difficult circumstances in the future and to inspire others to do so as well.
Yep.
That was very powerful when you read that, and so I underlined it and it stuck with me. And that's the first thing that popped into my head. Like, even when we do get taken advantage of and cheated on, lied to, backstabbed, whatever, I believe it's like necessary. It's like a big part of our growth and development.
That's good. You're right. Yeah, very good.
But I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying either, like from a morality perspective, or it's right or wrong.
Yeah, like this entire book, he can't contradict his Christian values because that's who he is. That's where he's coming from. But I'm coming at it from a philosophical approach. So I would revamp this love thing. I think self-love is the most important, which is different than selfishness. Is that you have a duty to yourself to take care of yourself, right? And some relationships and connections may help you grow and the other person grow more, right? And so we need to kind of figure that out. If another person doesn't take care of themselves, they don't care, you know, how much of yourself are you supposed to give them if they're not loving themselves? There's an assumption that both people love themselves and then we grow together. But if one person stops, or they engage in serious addictions or whatever's going on, or they're abusive, are you still supposed to love them? How do you reframe that? Are you responsible for their behavior? Right? No, you're not. You know, or if they're like abusive to the kid or something like that, like where do you draw the line here? You know what I mean? Like, come on. So yeah. Okay, next slide. Bam. Sir, we're gonna probably get through this. I'm gonna try to smash through this in 10 minutes. Circle of concern and the circle of influence. So circle of influence, we don't have control, others are not in control. A proactive focus on the circle of influence, focus on increasing degree of influence. Reactive focus is on the circle of concern, that which there is no control. So first is the circle of concern. This is like a Venn diagram kind of, right? And in this one, our influence is very small. There's things that we're concerned about that we don't have any influence over, right? And so to become more self-aware, bottom of 88, regarding our own degree of proactivity is to look at where we focus our time and energy. We each have a wide range of concerns. We're concerned about our health, our kids, our work, our debt, nuclear war. We separate those things from which we have no particular mental or emotional involvement by creating a circle of concern. So there's things that I'm not concerned about, like I'm not concerned about aliens. Personally, does not ever bother me. I don't think they exist. There's no evidence to indicate such, and it doesn't bother me. Some people are super stressed out about aliens. They're stressed about aliens. I'm not, right? Or like an asteroid coming to destroy the planet. Not really too concerned about it. Doesn't matter to me. About my dog, boom, it's in there. Sophia is in that circle. I am concerned about Sophia, right? Circle of influence is things that I have control over. So there may be things I'm concerned about, like Ukraine, but I have zero control over it. There's things I'm concerned about that I do have influence over, like the Philosophy Society. And I can indirectly talk about Ukraine, but that's all I can really do from this position, right? Or if I meet a Ukrainian person, I can help them in whatever capacity I can. But some things we are concerned about, we don't have influence over. And that's a waste of our emotional energy. So the serenity prayer, that's what this is about, right? We want the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, accept that I can't change the stuff out here. The courage to change the things I can, and then the wisdom is knowing where they are. What do I have influence over? What am I concerned over, right? Okay, 89 at the bottom.
Quick question.
Yes.
Do you think that'd be like a good homework exercise for us to do at home and then talk about it next week, maybe?
Sure.
To like write things that are of our concern and things that we can't like control and whatnot. And we can
Yeah.
like share our ideas, maybe. I was
If
thinking.
you guys want to do that, then at the beginning of class next week, you guys can do it at the board. That's great. It's great for people to see online too, to see it as an exercise. That's a great thing.
Let's do it next week.
Let's do it next week. All right, now you guys have homework. Uh-oh. The new
Yeah.
people are like, I came this like a homework. What's going on here? I got
Sweet.
Okay, 89 at the bottom. Look at the things within our circle of concern. Apparent that there are some things over which we have no real control and others we can do something about. Identify those concerns in the latter group by circumscribing them with a smaller circle of influence. By determining which of those two circles is the focus of most of our time and energy, we can discover much of our proactivity. Okay, so now we have this. We want to increase our circle of influence. Proactive people focus their efforts in the circle of influence. They work on things they can do something about. The nature of their energy is positive, enlarging, and magnifying, causing their circle of influence to increase. Reactive people, however, focus their efforts in the circle of concern. They think about the aliens and get upset about it, right? Focus the weakness of other people, the problems in the environment, the circumstances of which they have no control. Focus results in blaming and accusing attitudes, reactive language, and increasing feelings of victimization. Negative energy generated by that focus combined with neglect in areas they could do something about causes the circle of influence to shrink. So the reactive people, if they focus out here, they lose influence, which sucks, right? So on 91 at the bottom, as long as we are working within our circle of concern, we empower the things within it to control us. We aren't taking the proactive initiative necessary to affect positive change. The story of his son earlier was having serious problems in school. His wife and him were concerned about his weakness and how other people were treating him. Because that was in their circle of concern, as long as they put efforts into that concern, they got nothing out of it. They increased their own feelings of inadequacy and helplessness and reinforced their son's dependence. It's only when we went to work on our circle of influence, top of 92, when we focused on our own paradigms, we began to create a positive energy that changed ourselves, that eventually influenced their son as well. By working on ourselves instead of worrying about conditions, we're able to influence the conditions. Because of position, wealth, role, relationships, there are some circumstances in which a person's circle of influence is larger than their circle of concern. So, boom, here, right? We want the things we're concerned about to be relatively limited, but what we can influence is a lot, right? The situation reflects a self-inflicted emotional myopia. Oh, sorry, this is actually a bad. They don't care about other things. You want them to be equal. That's what you want. The proactive people have a circle of concern that is at least as big as a circle of influence, accepting the responsibility to use their influence effectively. So sometimes you can have a lot of influence, but you don't give a shit at all. And that's actually a bad thing. So Ayn Rand wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged, with like the most powerful guy in the world just didn't give a shit and didn't help anybody, right? So that's not good either. You need to care about some things, right? Okay, next. I have 4 minutes. So direct, indirect, and no control. So direct control, problems of our own behavior, solved by working on habits, circle of influence, and private victories. Indirect control, problems of others' behavior, solved by changing method of influence or public victories. No control, problems we cannot do anything about. The past, situational realities. Must accept problems and learn to live with them. So 93. The problems we face fall in one of the 3 areas. Direct control, problems involving our own behavior. Indirect control, problems involving other people's behavior. Or no control, problems we can do nothing about. Our past or situational realities. Proactive approach puts the first step in the solution of all 3 kinds of problems within our present circle of influence. Direct control problems, solved by working on our habits within our circle of influence, the private victories of habits 1, 2, and 3. Indirect control problems are solved by changing our methods of influence, the public victories, habits 4, 5, and 6. Personally identified more than 30 separate methods of human influence, like being empathetic in contrast to confrontation, being able to be persuasive. Most people only have 3 or 4 methods, like reasoning and not engaging in fight or flight. And he says it's liberating to accept the idea that we can learn new methods of human influence instead of using old, ineffective methods. No control problems involve taking the responsibility to change the line on the bottom of our face to a smile and accepting the problems and learn to live with them, even though we don't like them. Just being happy and being an acceptance. That's the serenity part. We do not empower these problems to control us. We share the spirit of an embodied, the Alcoholic Anonymous prayer, which is the serenity prayer. I just say cosmos instead of God. Cosmos, give me the courage to accept the things I cannot change, the serenity to accept the things, the courage to accept the things I can change, the serenity to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. The problem is direct, indirect, and no control. The first step in the solution, changing our habits, changing our methods of influence, changing the way we see our no control problems are within our circle of influence. Expanding the circle of influence. Example, the dictatorial executive manager. Proactive executive driven by values and not feelings. Anticipated, empathized, and read the situation of the director. Focus on circle of influence. Other executives were reactive by being vindictive. Executive responded proactively. Circle of influence expanded, so no decision was made without him. Success not dependent on circumstances. So he gives this example of like there's this director that's like authoritarian, and one of his managers or the executives learn to be proactive in this whole circumstance, right? So we choose how to respond to the circumstance. We powerfully affect our circumstance. We change one part of the chemical formula. We change the nature of the results. Top of 94. Okay, we're going to stop here. This is the nature of the beast today. We have 10 pages left.
Thank you for your time.
All right. You're welcome. We got almost all the way through it. So what do you guys think?
I like how we paused and like talked about different topics. It's kind of refreshing to not like be too concerned about getting a certain amount of material done, like an addendum type of style, and it's kind of like more laid back where we can learn and it's not like fully rushed.
Sorry, I am kind of rushing at the end, but yes, thank you.
A little bit, but it's okay. I understand. I'm just saying it's like it's refreshing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not like have to have like, we have to finish this chapter by week 5, whatever. So it's more focused on learning on quality over quantity.
This chapter is dense. There's a lot in this one, and so we'll just we'll just do it in two weeks. It's fine. And it's important for us to pause and talk about stuff because that way, whatever you guys think, I can connect it back or do a tangent discussion like we had, and then that indirectly connects it back anyways, right? It's important for learning. It's better that way. Any other thoughts? This is your first time here, what do you think?
Oh, good. I think I learned most of this in therapy, so I'm
Oh yeah.
not concerned about anything. But I think I'm like the Alice guy. I just simply don't care enough to do this.
I get it.
So yeah, but cool to learn all of this.
If we discuss it, maybe your motivation will be rekindled. Huh? If you feel that you can have some effect and some power. And I think the purpose of me doing this group is to do that, is to say like when you practice these skills, there'll be like a social ripple effect. And then you can invite other people to come too. And the more people from your social network that participate in this kind of context, when you guys go out, you bring this with you.
Actually, my roommate, like my best friend, she's creating a show where it's like people in their 20s, they use philosophy to deal with their issues. I told her about this group and she was like, oh, I wish like I could go.
She can join the WhatsApp chat, right? And then you guys can watch the YouTube videos together. And then I've written a bunch of stuff on the website, so you can go through that. And then there's opportunities for growth from a business perspective in different areas to take the stuff we have here and then identify certain markets and do money stuff with that. But there's lots of areas for growth. So you like it, you're happy. Very good. How do you feel?
Yeah, this group is amazing. It's very good. And are you gonna discuss more group or books after?
Yeah, we're going to do a critical thinking book next. And I think that having a book on mindfulness and meditation is probably the next best step. We're going to get through this first. I would like to do feeling good again, just so I get the videos online and then people get more practice with feeling good. What do you think?
Sure, yeah, I would love to go.
And so I posted the link to this, so you guys can order this, hopefully, and have it for next week. If you and your roommate work together, that'll really solidify your learning and then your involvement and stuff. That's a beautiful thing, right? And it's best if you guys both get your own book. I like to write in mine. When I underline stuff, I have like a conversation with the author. And that's a good thing. Okay, I'm gonna turn off the video. All right, thanks guys, we'll see you later.